Today we'll be discussing the common custom amongst people to daven for a sick person using their mother's name and not the father's. And we'll discuss the source for this and what do you do if you don't know the mother's name, etc. Before we begin, as always, this should not be relied upon for halachic psak. Rather, a rav should be consulted. It is well known that the common custom amongst Klal Yisrael is when you get an aliyah, you're called by your father's name. After death, it's usually by the father's name. Yet the one exception to that rule is when you're davening for someone who's a sick person in shul. If you have a mishabeh for cholim, you always use the mother's name. The example, if you have a person named Moshe and his father's name is Yaakov and his mother's name is Rachel, you say Moshe ben Rachel and not Moshe ben Yaakov. And the question is why? And what's the reason? What's the reason behind this? What's the source? So the Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Samach Vav Amud Beis, the Gemara says, Amr Abaya, Amr Li'aim, Abaya says that his mother, it was his adopted mother, Amr Li'aim, Kol Minyana B'Shma De'ima, that Abaya says, my mother told me that all incantations that use a name that are repeated should use the mother's name. So he was talking about when they had certain incantations that they were allowed to say, and they used, and part of that was saying the sick person's name. You should always use the mother's name, and that's pretty much the source for davening in general. Whenever you're davening for someone, you use the mother's name. The Truvas Gevul Yehuda Simon Beis points to this Gemara as the source for this custom to use specifically the mother's name and not the father. But the question is why. So the Gevul Yehuda says, "Ubetam hadavar efshel loymar shumach mas." To understand this, what he means is like this. Every time a child interacts with their father, they don't 100% know that that person is their father, because at the end of the day, the only person who you could know for sure is your parent, is your mother, because you came out of the mother. The father, is it possible that the mother really had relations with another man and the zera came from another man? It's possible. So because it's not 100% certain that it's the father, that father that you think is the father isn't actually the father, you should use the mother's name. Now he does acknowledge that from a halachic perspective, we do rely upon the notion, according to this, that there's no way to know who the father is. That means that if someone hits their father, he shouldn't get the death penalty for hitting the father, because who says that that's the father? The answer is to that, there's a rove. The rove tells us that there's a concept that if the father says he's the father and the mother says he's the father, rove tells us that he's the father, and you're allowed to rely upon that for halachic psak. However, says the Gevul Yehuda, that's all for halacha down here, but when you're davening in Shemayim, where the truth is necessary, it's better to use the mother's name and not the father, because the mother's the only person that you can know for certain is indeed related to the son. He indicates that the Zohar also says this. The Zohar writes that David HaMelech said, Hoshil leben amisecha, to help the son of your maidservant. So the Zohar already says, it's the Zohar in Lechacha, Daf Peidalid. Why did David HaMelech not say Ben Yishai? Why did he say the son of my mother? So it says the Zohar, we see from here that when you're davening, you should use the mother's name. So already, and the Zohar explains, because David could only be, the only certainty is that I'm my mother's son. I'm not my father's son is not as certain. So that's what the Zohar also seems to indicate, that teaching. However, as the Zohar says, the Iu Vadai, the only person that's certain is the mother. However, the Ben Yoyada, the Ben Ishchai, in Brachos Daf Nun Hey Amud Beis, he says like this: Hatam shemasker shem chama shem ima v'lo shem aviv. The reason why people use the mother's name and not the father's during davening is Omer Ha'olam. The average person will tell you, the understanding is ki imo vados yoser me aviv, because the mother is the only one that's certain, because it's possible that the mother actually had relations with someone else, and this is not really your father. He says, V'lo nichali b'zeh. I don't like this answer. V'adarabba yesh b'zeh chil kavod shemezalzel ba'aviv. That's disrespectful. That means every time you're davening, you're in essence questioning that who your father is, and you're questioning not only your father, he doesn't even say this, but you're questioning your mother also, because you're questioning who she actually lived with. So the Ben Ishchai says, I don't like this approach. That doesn't make sense to me, that should be the approach. And therefore he says the reason is very simple. Women are obligated in less mitzvos, and practically they do less averos than men. They don't have the obligation to learn Torah, which means they also don't have part of that is, unfortunately they don't have the mitzvah to learn Torah, but on the other hand, they also don't have the avera of bittul Torah. They also are naturally don't do the averas when it comes to arayas, lust. They're not as nichshol usually as frequently as men. So because the average woman does not have as many strikes against her, we'd rather mention the mother's name than the father's, because when you're davening to Hashem to save someone, you're looking up to Hashem and you're saying, please help this person. You don't want to mention anything that's negative. So to mention the father's name may not be good, because the average man does more averis, has more things against them than the average woman, and therefore, says the Ben Ish Chai, it's better to mention the mother's name than the father's name. That's what the Ben Ish Chai says. Ravad Yosef, he says shall carry, and he says there are more averis that are done b'tul Torah, and therefore the average woman has done less averis, so therefore it's better to mention the mother's name. Ravad Yosef and Yabia Omer Chelik Beis Siman Yud Aleph already questions this answer, because he says, how could the Ben Ish Chai forget about the Zohar HaKadosh? The Ben Ish Chai was Mekubal. He knew the Zohar backwards and forwards, so how could he skip this Zohar HaKadosh? That's the question of the Rav Avadia. The Chuvas Kavul Yehuda adds another reason to mention the mother's name and not the father's, because it's in order to avoid embarrassment for someone who's a Jewish person whose father is non-Jewish. In case of an intermarried couple, we don't want to mention the father's name because it could lead to embarrassment. That's what he said. It comes out that basically we have a couple reasons, either to avoid embarrassment. The other reason is because we know that we're more certain about the mother being related to him than the father, or the reason of the Ben Ish Chai is the average woman does less averis. But says Rav Avadia, we see from here that these are all nice reasons, but they're not, as they say, ma'akiv, meaning that if you don't know the father's name, if you don't know the mother's name, then you could say the father's name. People are very afraid to say the father. It's not such a big deal, because the whole reason to say the mother's name is not, listen, we mentioned a couple reasons, but none of them are binding to the point where you can't say the father's name. So he says, the whole concept of using the mother's name is it's a positive, but there's no issue with using the father's name. You could either just say his name, the person who's sick's name, or you could say the father's name. It's not a problem. That's the opinion of Avadia. Just to end off with two quick halachas, the Stipler Gaon, there's a Sefer Orchos Rabbeinu, page Samach Daled. It says, Amrli Moreinu Rabbeinu Zatzal. The Stipler Gaon said, B'Shem Marana Chazon Ish, in the name of the Chazon Ish, She'efel Uspal al Chol Gamim Lo Yodim Hashem Imo. If you don't know the mother's name, you should still daven for the sick person. Ve'eshel Haska B'Shemo HaPrati B'Shem Mishpachton. You could say his last name. You could say the surname. If you don't know the mother's name, so according to Ravad, you could say the father's name, and if you don't know the father's name, according to the Chazon Ish, you could say the last name, and that's not an issue. I just want to end off with something fascinating that I saw. It's brought down in the Sefer Shalmei Simcha, which is the customs of Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach regarding marriage and shidduchim and chasanas. It says over here on page Zayin, Chiddush Mufla Chiddush Rabbeinu, that Rosh Shlomo Zalman had a very big Chiddush, and that was Shebeshah Mispalim Al Metzia Shidduch L'Naira, that when you are davening for a shidduch for someone, in order for them to find a shidduch, Yesh Lahazkir Shma V'Shem Aviyah B'Davka, you should specifically use the father's name. Why? Mishum Shemitzanu Lashon Chachamim Bas Ploni LePloni V'lo Bas Plonis LePloni. That if when the Gemara mentions the concept of shidduchim, there's a famous Gemara in the beginning of Sota. It says 40 days kodem avlad, 40 days before the child is born. It's announced in heaven who's going to marry whom, and it says Bas Ploni LePloni, the daughter of this man to that chassan. So when it describes the girl, it says the daughter of a man. It doesn't say the daughter of a mother, it says the daughter of a man. So it says in Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, we see from here that specifically when it comes to shidduchim, it's important to mention the father's name. And therefore, when you're davening for shidduchim, you should mention specifically the father's name. Let's say you're davening for a girl, let's say the name is Leah. You should specifically say Leah Bas Yaakov and not Leah Bas Rachel. You should specifically say the father's name because that's the way the Gemara mentions it. He did add, though, that if you'd prefer to also mention the mother's name, you could do that. You could say Leah Bas whatever the name, I forgot the name already. Leah Bas Yosef, V'rayasai Rachel. That's what you could do. You can mention both, but it's important to mention the father's name. All questions could be sent to avizakatinsky@gmail.com, avizakutinsky@gmail.com.